war. War never changes. At least that's what they say. The last couple hundred years would beg to differ. It wasn't too long ago that us humans were mainly killing each other by hitting each other with big-ass blunt objects or stabbing each other with sharp objects. And as us humans have evolved, we have developed other ways to throw those big-ass or sharp-ass objects at each other and kill each other more effectively from a distance like that, until we have basically mastered this art, and now we have guns. And for the last couple hundred years, everything has been based around guns. And this has kind of went into our media as well, and the video games we play. And now, for the most part, all video games that are war-based, that are modern or sci-fi-based, tend to all be, well, shooters, right? Because melee combat and swords and whatnot, and large, sharp, and blunt objects, those are really a lost art in modern day, unless you live in the UK. And while, yes, melee-orientated weapons in combat in the modern day and age in modern warfare are less prevalent and not much of a main factor, and we usually think of warfare with guns from now on, in our video games, there's still this primal urge that us humans have, right, to get really personal with it, right, and hit each other with sharp or blunt-ass objects. And because of this, because game companies are supposed to provide experiences that are fun for everyone to enjoy, and oftentimes a lot of these first-person shooters will give the option of these melee weapons. So today, what I want to do is go over some of them, go over some games that do melee-oriented weapons, and how they differ from game to game, and some different approaches that I can come up with of melee, and some that I like, and the whatnot, and sort of the strategies behind them. First, let's talk about a very traditional first-person shooter game. Let's talk about probably the most classic, basic first-person shooter game someone would likely mention, which is Call of Duty. Call of Duty's melee system has kind of evolved over the years in ways, whether you find it as a progression or a degression, really depends on the person, but it is no doubt that it is different. In the early days of Call of Duty and the earlier Call of Duties, the melee served as a close-range win condition that was very effective as long as you could close the distance between you and your enemy. It was always a one-hit kill. While this knife in these earlier CODs was a strong win condition that would instantly kill enemies, it did have a few drawbacks, and that was if you whiff it, you fucking died. It was pretty much, there was no room to mess this up whatsoever. And in these newer Call of Duty games, they have added this sort of snapping property to their melee combat, right? As long as the enemy is in front of you in a close enough distance, your character would instantly snap to the enemy and just kind of boom. There is no room to really mess it up at all, and as long as they're within distance and within line of sight of you, you will hit them. This was not a thing in the earlier Call of Duties, meaning you could try to make the enemies whiff, right? You could try to move in and out of their range, or try to kind of move alongside them, cut an angle, move along the out of the way, and if you were able to make the enemy with this knife, if this is something that they are obviously going for, this is death. This is instant death, and there's really no room to mess this thing up. And this knife is unreactable with about an 8-frame startup with 43 frames of recovery for at least Black Ops 1, which we are counting frames as in 60 FPS, so every 60 frames is 1 second, meaning this is about 2/3 of a second that you are spending in recovery, right? Not to mention you have to add on the extra frame, so almost a whole second. And another factor to consider is, depending on what weapon you have, the knife counted as essentially toggling weapons. If you knife, then your guy would have to go back to whatever weapon he was holding and then switch to that before he could fire again. So quick maths, that's what, 51 frames. Plus, however much it takes for you to basically switch back to your weapon. So easily clocking in over a second of inactivity. So this, of course, means if you miss this knife, you're dead. No exceptions. There's almost no way someone would let you get away with this unless they're really bad and then have to reload, which that's a whole nother thing. And it's just, that would be a mess, right? But any reasonable, decent player would never let you whip this in a million years. This is sort of the risk that you're going for when going for this knife. It is sort of a last-ditch desperate effort. And to try and bait this and try to, well, you know, make them whiff. If you can do this properly, then this will make you, of course, win this interaction. However, the primary issue with this is if they see you doing this, if they think you are going to do this, they could just easily gun you down. They could not be going for this knife whatsoever. And in that case, you'll die just looking like an idiot. However, this is a universal melee that everybody has and is just there by default. It's not an actual weapon that you can select or not select on the roster, but it did leave a layer of mind games and did leave a bit of tension and trying to think about your opponent's actions while in close range. However, after that, in some of the later Call of Duties like Black Ops 2, they started to add some other melee weapons such as the ballistic knife. Now, I don't want to get too in-depth with the ballistic knife, but it did provide some benefits. One, you could shoot the knife out, but at that point, why not just have a gun? And two, it did provide a speed boost, so if you just wanted to run around and ruin little kids' days over Xbox Live, then feel free to run the ballistic knife. However, like I said, I don't want to get too in-depth with this because I did find a really good video going over the ballistic knife in detail, and really I couldn't do any better myself, so do check that out. I'll leave it in the description because it is a pretty good video if you care. But after that, they kind of evolved a little bit. They evolved to the more movement shooter, right? This was a big change as people kind of complained a lot that Call of Duties were getting stale. Call of Duties were becoming too similar. Every game felt the same. So, of course, Call of Duty tried to switch it up. And then people complained that it wasn't Call of Duty, but this is another rant for another day. So this is what added sort of this sci-fi aspect, this movement-type shooter game brought to you in Black Ops 3, right? And with this, they switched up the melee as well. No longer gone are the days of the one-hit instant-kill knife that can be whiffed and baited and all of that stuff. Instead, they added it where you need 2 knives to kill an enemy. Now, you can still go up behind somebody and hit them in the back, and if you were able to hit them in the back, this would instantly kill them. This sort of still gives the advantage of getting the drop on somebody and not having to waste the bullets. On top of that, shooting your gun in these games will show you show the enemies where you are. So it isn't always the best thing to go around guns a-blazing, so if you could sneak up on somebody and hit them in the back, this was very beneficial. Now, later, it has changed to the executions, right? This is the thing that the new Call of Duties have, is all the executions that they stole, right? And the reason they stole it, right, is because it has a lot of cosmetic potential. It has a whole lot of cosmetic potential to put these things into the game. There's a whole lot of cosmetic potential to with things like these executions, as well as they're just simply cool. They're simply cool, and you can sell a lot of different ones to appeal to a lot of people, and a lot of people really do have fun with these executions. But the main melee is 2 hits, but it still has the same drawbacks that the old one-hit knife melee did have, right? If you do it, fast, quick startup, but all of that recovery. Doing this has all that recovery, and you can't just melee and then melee. Against any decent player, they're just going to gun you down, and you will be out DPS because it will take almost 2 seconds to kill them, given that it takes damn near a second to get one melee out completely and then start the next melee. Because these are movement sci-fi shooters that are a lot faster paced, they added the snapping property to the melee, meaning that as long as you are within range and as long as the enemy can see you on screen, then boom, they will automatically lock onto you even if they are not directly looking at you. This was not a factor. If you're standing right here and I knife in Black Ops 1, I'm not hitting you. However, in Black Ops 3, if you're standing right here and I knife, my camera will turn and I will hit you. This changed up the entire way that the knife worked because it was essentially unavoidable. Now you couldn't really bait it. Now you could do something drastic, try to run and slide, try to jump backwards and use the jetpack away and all that stuff, try to get a lot of momentum and clear a lot of distance, and you could bait this in some capacity. The issue with it is not really. Like I said, it was so fast. I mean, it's not the same. But what this did do was it did provide a lot more tense combat in close quarters. It made it where essentially what this essentially does is make it where you have 50% less HP when fighting an enemy within close melee range. This makes it where I can't just instantly go for a melee as my result, but I have to tag the enemy a little bit, hurt them a little bit, then I can melee. And since it is unavoidable, their only options is to try to back up, run away to try and make it whiff, which will just let me gun them down more, or join in on the fray. If they can do 50% of my HP and do it with a melee, then they can win, right? It still kept a lot of strategy with a lot of depth intact, but did it in a kind of different way than the previous knives. And it was honestly better for it, and better for a game like Black Ops 3 that wanted a more emphasis on momentum, wanted more emphasis on movement, and wanted more emphasis on all of that kind of good stuff. On top of all of that, Black Ops 3 also added knives, a lot of knives. It's not just one knife like the ballistic knife, it was a shit ton. Bunch of different melee type weapons, and you could just start out with the normal traditional knife, and all of these melee weapons still had that snapping effect, right? Making it where as long as you're in distance, boom, melee, right? They also did provide a small bit of a speed boost, just like the ballistic knife did. And the main reason that these melee weapons were put in, and so goddamn many, is cosmetics, selling, right? It sells. You can sell a lot of these, gear a lot of these, have them do functionally all the same thing, but bunch of cool different weapons. Now, there were minor differences, like they had a lot of bigger swords, like katanas, and they had some nunchucks and boxing gloves and all that kind of stuff in Black Ops 3. However, like I said, you had to get it from the black market. And I'm not a fan of the black market. The black market was a scam, and it was impossible to fucking get anything decent out of that thing. But if you did want to open mommy's credit card for all your, for the black market coins or whatever the fuck they're called, then you could. And you may or may not get a cool looking knife. There, like I said, there were some minor differences, but generally the difference between them is the smaller ones were a bit faster, but had less range, right? Meaning that you had more room to mess them up. You had more room of error, but in return, you had to close more distance. And the bigger weapons, like something like a katana, would have less room of error, as if you whiffed it, you'd have a lot more recovery, but you don't have to close nearly as much distance. But for the most part, it was mainly cosmetic. Nobody really gave a second thought about these factors. And it was mainly just whatever knife you thought looked cool and had the coolest animation, and that's what you ran with. And that's kind of how the game went. Both Call of Duty as well as the community knows, nobody choose different melees over other ones based on their stats. People chose different melees over other ones based on how cool they looked, because why else would you? This whole concept, there's a very detailed video I did find about it as well, going over this whole concept. However, the best one I could find was for Call of Duty Mobile. It's the same thing, it works the same way, it's just for Call of Duty Mobile. So, I mean, I'm going to leave that one too if you want to check that one out. It's pretty good, but at the end of the day, it's for Call of Duty Mobile. I don't know what to tell you. I'm as disappointed as you are. I couldn't find a good one on Black Ops 3. Trust me, I tried. But overall, these are two different approaches to the melee, and both of them are good in their own right? One of them is sort of a last-ditch, a desperate attempt, a gamble, if you would, to put all of your eggs in one basket with some room of error and some room to be baited. And the second one, on the other hand, sort of creates a lot more tension, creates these close combat scenarios to be a lot quicker, a lot faster, and not give you a whole lot more time to think, right? So, very interesting approaches. However, in the recent Call of Duties, both of these things have went out the window, right? In the more modern Call of Duties, they've changed up the melee system. They want to go for a game that's more fun. They want to approach the game in a more fun lens and try to make things as satisfying and appealing to a casual market than going for something that has a lot more depth, has a lot more strategy, and they want to avoid limitations, right? And with the recent melee, even with pistols and whatnot, it's come to a point where they're basically a target combo, if you will, right? It is essentially a bunch of linking animations together with very minimal to no recovery whatsoever, right? The way it works is, instead of being a one-hit knife, like you do this, or a one-hit melee like that, it's instead a bunch of linking animations that go like this, and with damn near no recovery. Damn near no recovery whatsoever. Meaning it's not all too punishing if you mess them up, and on top of that, it still has the snapping property, which there's no real need, given that you don't have the advanced movement that you have in Black Ops 3. This has been a big problem I've had with a lot of the recent Call of Duty games, and why I don't touch the shit anymore. As someone who used to play a lot of Call of Duty when I was a lot younger, I just can't anymore. But overall, the game has been trying to clearly appeal to certain people. It's been trying to appeal to a casual market, and their only goal with this game is not even necessarily to have a fun experience. Their goal with this game is to take your money, and they want to appeal to casuals. They want to appeal to as broad of an audience as possible, and a broad audience includes children, and includes people who don't want to think, includes people who don't like limitations. This is something I can't stand, as a good game needs some limitations, and this has been seen all over the place. These Call of Duty games have been stripping a lot of mechanics that provided necessary limitations, something even as simple as the sprint. In the older Call of Duty games, you could only sprint for a couple seconds before your character was winded, and you couldn't sprint anymore, and you had to wait. It was basically a cooldown, essentially, and it made you have to think strategically about how you ran and when you ran and all that kind of thing. And now it's just, you don't even think about it at all. You can almost keep running forever, I'm pretty sure. And sprinting is not a thing to think about anymore. There's a lot of little minor things that they kept trying to basically limit and reduce and whatnot that made you, in earlier games, have to think about your actions, had to think about everything you were doing and the way you took every scenario. And it created the game to be a lot more strategic. But this isn't just a problem with Call of Duty, but a problem with the modern gaming sphere in general. Is thinking is bad. Being slow, methodical, trying to plan ahead, trying to calculate risk-reward, trying to find the pros and cons of every scenario and try to find a way out, and try to actually have some strategy and think about your actions and the consequences that come with those actions. They don't like that, because that turns off some people. That turns off people that could give you money. And as you know, the people who don't like to think about the consequences of their actions like to give more money than anyone else, and those are the last people you want to piss off. So it's kind of whatever, and now every game has been, be more aggressive, be faster, get straight into the fray, and don't slow down. Faster equals better. More aggressive equals better, and it's hurting gaming a lot. Less limitations, less all of these things. And is part of the reason a lot of the recent Call of Duties have sort of fallen off, at least in my eyes. Overall, they just want to equal the playing field. They want to remove the skill ceiling, make everyone on an even level, and even like something as simple as recoil. A lot of these games have little to no recoil. Every gun is a fucking laser beam and just feels like I'm shooting Nerf darts. It's almost pathetic. I can't recall the last time I felt recoil in a Call of Duty game that I needed to even manage, control, or think about whatsoever, which was not a thing in the previous Call of Duty games. They were unpredictable. It was a lot harder to fire your gun. But like I said, all of these limitations are things that turn your audience away. So I don't want to turn this into a whole rant. I'm digressing a little bit. But for the most part, in most games that are FPS orientated, the whole gimmick with Melee is it is strong. It is a very, very, very strong. That will basically mean you will win any interaction as long as you close the distance with your enemy. But you have to close that distance. You have to clear that gap between you and your enemy. And this goes for RPGs as well, and RPG builds too. Games like Fallout and the whatnot, right? If you are trying to run a melee build in a game where everyone has guns, the main difficulty of that build is trying to be able to find ways to close the distance between you and your enemy. And you're going to need a fuck ton of health, you're going to need a lot of strength, you're going to need a lot of things that can really keep you pushed forward, right? Really keep you moving forward, and you can't be frail, you can't be flimsy, you gotta be strong, right? And while we're kind of on the topic of sort of closing that distance, this brings me to my next game that I want to talk about, which is Halo. And while there's a lot to talk about with Halo's Melee, the main thing I want to focus on here is the Energy Sword and the way that the Energy Sword functions. Because the Energy Sword is a very interesting Melee move and has become very iconic to Halo, probably one of the most iconic weapons in the Halo franchise, and one that even people who haven't played Halo do enjoy and do like. The Energy Sword is extremely interesting in the way that it works. It kind of takes that snapping property that the newer Call of Duties have and multiply it times 10, multiply it times 100. The way that it works is you have the sword and you can swing it as much as you want, and it doesn't do anything. Just like a normal knife in something like Call of Duty, you can swing it as much as you want and nothing will happen. However, as long as you're in the distance within an enemy, boom, it will make you lunge forward and swipe at that enemy, instantly killing. Now, while of course this melee is a predecessor to a lot of the recent Call of Duty melees, right, this sword still keeps the same general game plan. The whole plan here is to try to close distance on the enemy, but you just have to close less. As long as you're within a certain radius, the radius of the energy sword's effectiveness, boom, you will lunge forward, and it's checkmate, right? You don't necessarily need to be point blank. And while in something like Call of Duty, this would be really fucked up to lunge almost 10 feet forward, or 15 feet or whatever, forward towards the enemy, instantly killing them. In something like Halo, this is more necessary, right? In something like Halo with a lot larger open maps, especially these older Halos like Reach and whatnot, right? This is a lot more necessary than in something like Call of Duty. And a lot of times when we talk about balancing and what's good for games and whatnot, it depends on the game and the way that the maps are structured and the way that all of the abilities operate together in tandem. But this limitation of just having it where the melee only enacts and the lunge only enacts when you are attacking an enemy is very, very cool. And it essentially adds the limitation of, while this could have just been a separate mechanic, while it could have just made you lunge every time you used it, this makes it where it's not that. It's not a mobility tool, and that's not what it's there for. And it's truly no wonder and no surprise this weapon has become so iconic, and so iconic to the franchise. Right? It's become so iconic, in fact, that there was a whole game mode made after it, right? The Flood, right? People would essentially go in and play tag, and it's become a very big part of a lot of Halo stuff, right? And it's been a game mode that has stood the test of time, basically zombie tag or Turned or something like that. And other games have copied it with their own version of Turned, right? Games like Call of Duty as well. One person runs around with a knife, kills a guy, that guy goes in, now he runs around with the knife, and kind of moves on until the last man is standing. And that's the way it works, and it's right, and the enjoyable part is that struggle to try to close the distance on the enemy, and the enemies struggle to try and keep that distance and try to stop them before they can get to you, or get in range to enact what they want to do. Right, and it's that satisfaction that it brings when you're able to really get that melee finally, right? When you finally are able to close the distance, is what makes melee weapons just so satisfying and so iconic, and something like the energy sword so iconic in an FPS game, a game that really has no business having melee weapons in the first place. So what about some other games? What about some other games that are a little bit less traditional, right? Let's talk about my favorite game of all time, Titanfall 2. So to start off, the Titans have a universal melee. The melee is roughly 18 frames, so about one third of a second. This is on the verge of human reaction. You can react to this just by motion. However, this isn't a game like Tekken or Street Fighter or something along those lines where you have multiple things to look out for. So if you see this motion, you can react to it, but I mean, at some point there's not a whole lot you can do unless you're running something like a phase shift ability. And as far as recovery goes, the universal melee has 19 frames, right? So 18 frames of startup, 19 frames of recovery. Unlike something like Call of Duty that has 12 frames of startup, instantaneous, unreactable, and then almost a second of recovery, this does not. Boom, in, out, and you can basically keep doing that over and over again. This basically makes it where you can go in and wail onto the enemy and just keep punching over and over again, and it doesn't feel as rigid, it doesn't feel as limited, it isn't as detrimental or punishing as something like Call of Duty. However, unlike Call of Duty, it's not a win condition. The melee does relatively little damage compared to everything else, right? It does essentially chip damage to Titans. However, it's very useful for its utility. It's useful to, well, of course, kill grunts, kill other things, kill pilots to prevent them from messing with you, to prevent them from rodeoing you, right? It's useful for that to stop pilots from doing the things they want to do before they can do it, as well as it has a property that it will knock back to enemy Titans. This will push them backwards, and can help you create space and kill their momentum as well, which can be useful for certain specific Titans that want to push in and get close on you. And the final thing that it's useful for is it can be a win condition under the condition that the Titan is in critical HP. If a Titan is in critical HP, then the Titans will perform an execution. Right, it will perform an execution, doing a little bit of cutscene, guaranteeing not only a kill on the Titan, but a kill on the pilot as well. However, just like Call of Duty, where there is the recovery to pull out your gun, the same thing can be said for Titanfall as well. after you punch, while it does have a very quick recovery, meaning you can keep punching over and over again, but if you want to basically just do one punch, you're done, swap to your, and then take out your weapon, you have to wait for your Titan to essentially equip that weapon, which for a lot of these Titans takes almost a second or two, a long time to really get this thing moving. So if you want to just go in and punch, it will have, and just do one punch, it will have a lot of recovery, similar to Call of Duty. So of course this makes it where a lot of times you don't want to go for this melee. A lot of times, even if it might be good, unless you really need that space, unless you really need to clear that distance, you're putting damage off the table. You're throwing away some damage that you could be doing because you have to take almost a second to go in, punch, come back from the recovery, and then come back from the recovery of pulling your weapon. However, there's one Titan that doesn't have the universal melee. It has a special melee, and that is Ronin. Ronin, instead of punching you really hard, has a big-ass sword. And what he wants to do with that big-ass sword is cleave you with it naturally. This sword has considerable more damage than the universal melee, which makes it much more of a valuable option for actual melee than utility, right? For something like the universal melee, damage is not going to be in the forefront of your mind. But for something like Ronin's sword, it is. However, it still has all of the same properties that the universal melee has. There are a handful of drawbacks to Ronin's sword, right? And the first one is it actually has more startup than the universal melee. For whatever reason, it has about 30 frames of startup. But it still has that 19 frames of recovery, keeping it consistent with the other characters, which makes me think this is intentional, that Respawn knew what they were doing. However, it's not that big of a deal that it has a bit more startup, considering that it does a whole lot more damage. So overall, you're still getting more DPS out of your melee than the normal Titans are. It still keeps the same amount of pushback, which isn't great for the Ronin, considering that he wants to be up close, considering that it is counterintuitive to what he wants. However, makes his sword core, which is his ultimate, a lot better. This sword core removes all of the pushback that his melee has, giving it almost none, making it where it's a lot harder to run away from him. On top of that, he gets a shit ton of dashes, and they recharge super quickly, so it's almost impossible to run from him. The big thing with Ronin is a lot of times the difficulty with these melee-based characters is closing this distance, but Ronin is very well designed in many different ways, and closing the distance with Ronin is not difficult at all. The difficulty with Ronin is not closing the distance. The difficulty is instead being able to close the distance and not fucking die immediately. Strider class Titans have less health than both the Atlas and the Ogre class Titan. And because of this, if the Ronin pulls up carelessly on something like, let's say, an Ion or a Scorch, he could definitely lose that interaction. And he has to kind of work around his weaknesses and work around his strengths and measure all of that kind of bullshit in order to get an advantage on the enemy. And that's sort of the beauty of Ronin in a way, that allows him to do that. He has a lot of very good defensive capabilities that allows him to do that, and allows him to be close range and go toe-to-toe with enemies with a lot more health, with not only his phase shift, but also he has a block that reduces his damage as well. But the interesting thing is his primary weapon, which is his shotgun, which already makes him want to be close range, considering it has a whole lot of drop-off, as well as after a certain distance, the projectiles just dissipate. They're fairly slowly moving, and he really does need to be close range to actually make these things work. This shotgun has an incredibly fast fire rate and very good DPS. However, the only drawback really is it has 4 shots, meaning this cannot be his main source of damage, and there's really no way, reasonably, it can be his only source of damage. He must use his melee, and this melee is essential. If he had any other weapon from any other Titan other than Scorch, then he wouldn't necessarily need to use this melee, but this shotgun requires it, and he has to be clever in order to basically squeeze out as much use of this shotgun as possible. Because even just going in ham and meleeing can't be his only source of damage either. He needs to really use both, as he won't out DPS really anybody just going in and mashing melee over and over and over again, just slicing with the sword. He needs to use both, and he needs to do clever things, like he needs to be able to hide his reload behind things like his phase shift. He needs to sort of create opening, use his environment a little bit, to use his arc wave to try and disrupt and move around, and try to find openings where he can get this reload off, because if he can do an extraordinary amount of damage. More damage than really any other Titan at a close range. And this is kind of what I love so much about Ronin, is he's a Titan that really has to be clever to get what he wants. He can't just rely on just his melee. He can't just rely on just his shotgun. Both will fail. He has to use all of them and use all of his abilities to their maximum potential in order to win. And if he doesn't, then, well, he'll die. He's too squishy and to really stand up against a lot of the other Titans. And he wants to be in melee. He wants to be in the fray. He wants to be close. He can't function otherwise, unlike Northstar, right? Northstar really wants to avoid conflicts. He wants to waste your time. He wants to stay as far away from you as possible and deal as much damage to you as possible before you can close the distance on him. Ronin's the opposite, and Ronin can't survive like that. Ronin doesn't work like that. But being in close is inherently dangerous. It is inherently difficult, and that's the beauty of Ronin, is he's capable of doing so much. However, he also has so many cons. He has so many pros that it makes him capable of doing so much, but he also has so many cons and so many limitations that he has to work around. And I love this character to death, and I love this Titan to death, as well as I love this game to death. But since we're already on this topic, let me get into Overwatch, right? This game is built around sort of finding any style of play that you might want, that can be offered, will be offered. And that includes being able to hit people with large and sharp objects. First, I want to talk about the universal melee and the melee as a whole. The melee as a whole kind of serves as a way to confirm a kill, kind of previously, as I stated before, as a very quick burst attack move that can do a lot of damage immediately, but has all of that recovery, so it can't be your only source of DPS. You can't just keep punching over and over again. You're not going to win like that, but is very useful for especially a lot of characters. Now, the melee is relatively the same for all characters. There are some minor frame differences with each character. I haven't checked them recently. I'd be fucked if I could remember all of them, but I do know this. For the most part, every Overwatch character had around 4 frames to 8 frames of startup on their melee, as well as they have around 30 to 35 frames of recovery. I can't recall any characters that didn't have that, which basically means very fast, very quick startup, almost instantaneous like that, completely unreactable, but on the flip side, it has almost a half a second of recovery. So, for the most part, this melee is, like I said, really only going to be usable for finishing off enemies. It certainly varies. Like, I know, for certain, some of them that I know is Lucio's is 4 frames of startup. I know that. Sigma's is 5 frames. But the average is, I believe it's 7 frames for the majority of characters. Tracer's is 7 frames. Winston's 7 frames. Genji's is 7 frames. And some of them are a little bit slower, being at 8 frames, which is McCree's, and Mercy's, I believe, are 8 frames as well. Those are just a couple that I know off the top of my head. I did actually, God, if I could find this now, considering that this probably would have been like 6 years ago, but I did actually have a whole chart listing down every Overwatch characters at the time, their startup on their melees, as well as the recovery that they had as well. But fuck if I could find that today. I did post it on some subreddit forever ago. God knows if I could find it. It got like 11 upvotes, and it is what it is, right? So, no idea where the hell it is. I'm not going to make another one. I'm not touching this game ever again, right? But for the most part, it's not noticeable in the slightest. On top of that, unlike the previous games mentioned before, like Call of Duty as well as Titanfall, Blizzard certainly did purposely go out of their way to make it where the recovery for drawing the weapon is not a factor and is not taken into consideration as well. Even if the character is still recovering from the animation and has the gun completely behind their head, they're still able to shoot. The gun doesn't necessarily need to be lined up and set into the proper location to shoot. It kind of just snaps to where it needs to be. And this makes it where they can still add all of this flair, still add all of the sort of twirlies and spinnies that they want without having to fuck with the recovery, making it awkward or too different. And for the most part, every single melee in this game is pretty much exactly the same. All of them are relatively similar in frame data. It's not noticeable in the slightest. And I don't think anybody knows about the differences in their melee. Nobody cares either, certainly. And I don't even think there's anyone in the entire Overwatch community who even bothered to look at the frames or even thinks like that in the first place. Especially because, like I said, these are Overwatch players and they almost intentionally are ignorant and purposely go out of their way not to know anything. It's truly a skill that they have. And like I said, this has to be one of the most volatile, ignorant communities ever, or ignorant fan bases ever, right behind Taylor Swift fans, which, don't worry, oh, those Taylor Swift fans will get a whole video just for them. That's certainly on my YouTuber bucket list, is to piss off Taylor Swift fans as well. But overall, I digress. Some characters certainly do get a whole lot more mileage out of their melee than others, especially characters that can close distance easier, right? Characters like Tracer, as well as Lucio, are able to close distance very quickly, very fast, and sort of cut out enemies, right? And take them out before the enemy can even think. And of course, because of this, they get a lot of mileage out of their melee. But other characters that are a bit more longer range don't really find themselves in this scenario all too often, likely aren't going to be used much to capitalize or confirm a kill like that. They're not going to get nearly as much mileage out of this melee. However, there are some characters who are just melee, and the one I want to talk about first is Reinhardt. He is certainly probably the biggest example of a melee character in this game, and probably the most popular overall and the most easily recognizable. He has a big-ass hammer and swings it around, and a lot of the difficulty with this character comes with trying to figure out how to close the distance, so you can swing said big-ass hammer on your enemies. But how you do this is up to you, and there are a couple different approaches, and this is what makes the character very interesting and very unique, is his many different ways that you can play him, right, and try to approach every single encounter that you come into. And as a tank, the main goal behind the tank is to create space and not give it back. And just having the threat of a big hammer is going to inherently create space and make people want to avoid you and make people want to run from you. Right? For the vast majority of the roster, this is a fight that you cannot win. He can try to either A, close the distance by sort of being slow and methodical and pushing himself up with his team and pushing himself up with the shield, or he can say, fuck it, I'm going to shift, and then just mash the shit out of it, which will initiate his charge, which will make him move forward very fast in order to try and close distance, and he can cancel it to try and close distance. However, this is much riskier. You don't have that protection of the shield, and you're likely going to get yourself killed, right? Also, there's a fun little neat tidbit about Reinhardt's swing that I find pretty cool, which is unlike a lot of other melees in a lot of these other games, it's not sort of like a sudden hit effect, and it's actually sweeps from side to side, meaning that and has a bunch of active frames, right? Meaning that him swinging from left to right and where he's looking does actually make a difference on the startup and the recovery of his hammer swing. And the closer you are to one side or another where he started the swing from, will have less startup and he'll have more recovery. And the opposite is true for the farther you are from one side to another. This is why a lot of times you'll see a lot of Reinhardt players move their cursor or their camera from left to right whenever they swing, right? It is because they want to hit you on the first couple frames of the startup of his swing as soon as possible. Overall, it doesn't make a big difference over on your overall DPS, but it is pretty neat and it is pretty interesting, and I felt like it was worth noting, right, and worth mentioning. And at a first glance, it seems like you don't have an option. It seems like you don't have an option for a high mobility DPS based character, because the issue with a character like, let's say, Reinhardt, that can do a lot of damage at close range and has to worry about closing distance with high mobility, is that that's impossible to balance. That's an impossible task to balance, as if they do 2 to 3 hits like Reinhardt does with their melee, then, well, this just would make them too strong. They get close to you and you instantly die. However, the issue is, if they did more than that, doing 4 or more hits with their melee, this would make them way too weak. And with a character like a sort of hit scan projectile-based character that could just shoot you in the head once or twice, why would I play a character that limits themselves with range versus a character that has good range and can do good damage on me, right? Why would I do that? That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And that's sort of the difficulty with balancing something like this, balancing a character with a lot of mobility, as well as having their damage just be melee based. And this was the issue that Blizzard originally encountered when trying to create Genji. Originally, Genji and Hanzo were the same character. They were both Hanzo, and essentially what they did was they switched between a bow and a sword, and they would switch and toggle back and forth and were the same character. However, of course, this was very, very early in development, and this was a mess because it was basically a 2-for-1 deal. You had a very strong close-range character combined with a very strong long-range character, and there was really that just makes him too good at everything. So of course they had to split them up, and they created Genji and they created Hanzo, right? And had them both have similar mechanics to keep them kind of the same, but also make them a little bit different. Now, Genji's original design was to be just basically a melee stealth-based character. He was supposed to kind of run around and then pop up on top of you, trip you, stab you, do that kind of thing, and be a stealth-based melee-orientated character. But of course, this causes the problems that I mentioned before. It's inherently difficult to balance something like that. It's inherently difficult to balance a character that can close distance on you with like that, and then just kill you in an instant and then just run away, just like that, right? It's very difficult to balance something like that. It's very difficult to balance a melee character with high mobility. So, of course, they ended up not going with this design and instead tried to make him basically have shurikens. But the way they designed these shurikens was very clever that still made him, in a way, kind of a melee character, right? He has two fires, which I'm sure most people know how Overwatch works and know how Genji works as well, considering how popular this game is and how iconic he is, but I'll go over it again. Genji has two primary fires, one that shoots 3 shots in a burst in a row, and a second one that shoots sort of horizontally, and kind of scatters out as almost like a shotgun shot, right? These shots both don't have any drop-off, and they both do really good damage, right? The issue with them is they're slow. They're relatively slow. The first shot is very slow projectiles that you can see and kind of just move out of the way, right? From a long distance, you're not going to get hit by all of them. And the second shot scatters all over the place, right? From a long distance, you won't be able to hit the other 2 shots. So you can kind of settle for a small amount of damage, but you're not going to get all of those hits, and you're going to do relatively little to no damage. So you need to be close with these. You need to be close to get that secondary and that primary fire off. On top of that, he has this sort of awkward pause in between his attacks, which allow him to easily fit in a knife and a melee, where other characters a lot of times don't really find this pause to kind of fit this in. So he gets a lot of mileage out of his melee, and just for the same reasons like Tracer and Lucio, he has a lot of mobility, allowing him to easily close distance and sort of finish an enemy off with a melee as well as his shurikens. And because of this, he's almost perfectly geared to work with the melee in this game, meaning he's going to get a whole lot more mileage out of his melee than any other character on the roster, by a fuck ton, by a lot more than anyone else. And he already wants to be inherently close, making him essentially this pseudo melee type character where he wants to be close, yet he's not actually melee, right? Where he's basically melee, but he's not. And of course, because of this, they also make it where his ultimate, he pulls out his sword and he goes full 100% melee, right? He stops pretending that he's a melee character and actually becomes a melee character. And this is super cool. And like I said, it's allowed to be as unbalanced and messed up as they want because it's an ultimate, right? You're not going to get it forever, and it's only for a temporary amount of time. So that's kind of the benefit of something like that's kind of how they've sort of geared a DPS character to melee. But they also did another attempt to try and make a full dedicated melee character that was actually melee, right? And that is DoomFist. DoomFist was sort of their second attempt at melee, and sort of a different kind of style, right? As well, he's kind of a pseudo melee character, sort of like Genji is, and he does get a lot of mileage out of his primary melee, considering the weird way his primary fire works. But the main way that they were able to get him to work is, instead of just sitting there holding down left click to get his kills, he instead has to rely on combos. He has to rely on setting up his attacks, and has to rely on uppercuts and charge fist and seismic slam, and all of his abilities basically work in this very weak sort of fashion, and they're all inherently weak by themselves, but when used in combination can create something very strong. And he has to be clever and use all of these abilities in combination in order to make them work together, in order to make them work at a close range and make him a proper melee character. And DoomFist was a very good attempt at this, which they sort of undid all of that and undid the way that he works in order for Tank DoomFist, which is a darn shame. But naturally, as someone who really enjoys DoomFist and someone who really enjoys Genji, I always thought to myself, why? Why isn't there more characters on the roster like this? Why don't they make a whole game geared around this? Why aren't there more characters that are just as good as these two? And I always thought that. And then I found Paladins, right? And Paladins has a very interesting approach to melee. Now, Paladins doesn't have a universal melee. It doesn't have anything like that. Most characters cannot punch the enemy, unlike something like Overwatch, where every character can melee. But there are some characters that certainly do have a melee. Someone like Androxus has a very traditional style melee where he has a big punch that, once again, fast startup, very long recovery, making it where it's very good at confirming and finishing off an enemy, right? Androxus really takes this melee this universal melee and makes it his own, and it makes Androxus very unique in this way. And this is something that I really love about Paladins, and something that I admire about this game so much, is that this game has different loadouts. This game has cards, and how strong you want your character to be and how strong you want their abilities to be depends on what you want, and what abilities you want your character to gravitate towards and work around depends on how you set your build up, right? And for some Androxus players, this melee might be a crucial, essential part of their game plan and might be used all the time. But for other Androxus players, this might be an afterthought and not even taken into consideration. And it allows a lot of different depth and a lot of different play styles just in the way that you set up your loadout for something like Androxus. And this is something that I love about this game and something that I love about Paladins. On top of that, there are some very traditional style melee characters. There's a character like Terminus. Terminus is similar to Reinhardt. He's got a big axe. He swings it around. It's scary. Stay away from him. You don't want to be close to him, right? That's Terminus. And he kind of wants to close that distance and find a way to do that in order to swing his axe around. It is what it is, but that's whatever, right? But the main interesting part about the main real melee characters are pseudo melee characters, just like DoomFist, just like Genji, and there's a lot of them. Characters like Tiberius, Zin, Maeve, Zahn, Nyx, Vora, Koga. Hell, I would even consider something like along the lines of Caspian, Grover, Edie, and Fiora kind of within that sort of pseudo-melee character category. All these characters are sort of within this pseudo-melee character category, like DoomFist, like Genji, and there's a fuck ton of them that want to be close range, but aren't necessarily close range, and not really shotguns either. Fiora might be within that exception, as she does have basically just a shotgun. However, she's got the pyre, which sort of works in this similar fashion as well, right? But all of these characters, this is a big thing with Paladins as well. It is high fantasy. It's basically a high fantasy world, but it's also trying to be a hero shooter. A lot of characters have guns, and it's kind of awkward and weird, and they just sort of say, like, fuck it. Some characters, it's just like, they straight up are just strapped, but some characters, they try to be clever with them, and they try to make it where they still have swords, still shoot projectiles, but they gotta work around basically being melee characters that aren't really melee. So they make a lot of these pseudo-melee characters, and the game's good for it. And these are the best characters and my favorite characters in each one of these games. And each one of these characters have their own strengths and weaknesses, and they want to be close, but aren't necessarily close range. And a lot of them don't even have drop-off or anything like that. However, these projectiles are so slow, you can often just move out of the way. You don't have to just stand there. You can move out of the way, and nobody's going to get hit by them, right? So these characters still want to be close and still need to close that distance, and the closer they are, the more effective that they will be. But the main interesting thing is, just like DoomFist and just like Genji, these characters, each and every one of them, are to some degree reliant on their cooldowns. Without their abilities, they will almost always lose any interaction between just like a traditional shooter type character. Something like Victor, Tyra, Leanne, or Vivian, right? So because of this, they have to muster the most amount of utility out of their abilities and properly be able to confirm kills and think about their cooldowns, which will, of course, make them extremely powerful. But the thing that makes them the most interesting is when they have to fight each other. All of these characters want to be close range to maximize their effectiveness. However, the issue with this kind of thing is the enemy wants to be close range as well, and they can't both just go head-to-head. Usually that will end in a scramble that will be inconsistent, and you don't want an inconsistent playstyle. So a lot of times, you'll need to try to bait abilities. You need to try and bait their cooldowns. You need to try and bait certain stuff out of them to try and capitalize and gain a real advantage on the enemy, right? Just like something like Genji or DoomFist. And each one of these characters have a lot of little different gimmicks that make them unique in their own way, and since they're so reliant on their cooldowns, if you can bait one of these abilities, this gives a big advantage. And it makes you have to think a lot, and it leads to a whole lot of mind games, and makes every interaction when these characters fight with each other, makes every single one of these interactions feel unique and different, and leads to so much depth in so many different mind games, and is really what hero shooters should be, and really what hero shooters offer, and really what the whole game should be based around. And how something like Overwatch should be based around, and how more heroes should be based around this. And I think Marvel Rivals is trying to gear their game sort of to like this, but I don't like their approach. And I don't want to turn this into a rant for Marvel Rivals, but the whole thing is it creates so much depth where you can't just go in, you can't just dive all in. And you gotta find your openings, and they gotta find their openings. And while both of you are very strong at close range, you also kind of have to move out of your range and out of their range. And you have to move back and forth and find different openings and bait certain different things. And in a way, it's a lot like fighting games. In something like fighting games, you're going to be moving in and out of their range, moving within your range when you're strong, and moving out of their range when you're weak. And just sort of trying to find your advantage, trying to find your plus frames, trying to find an opening to go in. And it leads to the same kind of mind games, these characters, when they interact with each other, that you don't get in traditional shooters, that you don't get playing a character like Vivian or Victor, or in something like Overwatch, you're not going to get playing a character like Soldier 76 or something along those lines. It leads to a whole nother world, a whole nother game that is so much more interesting, and is truly what hero shooters offer, and is truly the beauty of hero shooters. But a lot of people play this game and don't even experience this. I'd say each and every one of these characters that I mentioned are relatively even in a head-to-head combat if they have all their abilities off cooldown, except for Grover, but he's a support, right? And it could really be anyone's game, but it just depends on how clever you are, and how well you're able to capitalize on your enemy's weaknesses and your strengths. And that's what I love so much about these pseudo melee characters. But that's pretty much it for the pseudo melee characters for Paladins. But there's one last game before I go that I want to talk about, and that is Killing Floor.
LeBron James.
Scream if you love Killing Floor.
Gosh.
Thanks, buddy!
What do you think you're doing?
Ha!
Oh, I love Killing Floor! This game does so much right. This game fucking does so much right. I love Killing Floor. Killing Floor is certainly one of my favorites, and is an absolute underrated gem. And I could spend all day fanboying over Killing Floor, but I just want to talk about the melee. So the way the melee works is super cool. It's of course a zombie round-based survival game, something akin to Call of Duty Zombies. But unlike Call of Duty Zombies melees, where you just kind of boom, activate it, and you just start swinging, right? This melee is, you actually have to aim it, right? It sounds super weird, but you actually have to aim your melee. On top of that, you have a block with the melee, which the block works a lot like Sekiro. You'll take a lot of chip damage and whatnot if you're just sitting there blocking all day. It won't block everything, but you can parry as well. If you time it correctly, you can parry the zombies, stunning them, leading you to an opening. And the way the melee works is super cool because you aim it, right? You have to look at specific things, and your character will actually hit specifically where you are looking. And the way you move matters as well. If you move over to the left, your character will swing to the left. If you move over to the right, your character will swing to the right. And if you move forward, your character will swing down. And this leads to a lot of good stuff. Swinging side to side basically allows you to hit multiple zombies at once, allow you to hit multiple enemies at once, and is going kind of for bulk. So it's very good in a big horde crowd. However, swinging straight down is good against one zombie, right? Moving forward and swinging straight down hits one zombie at a time, hits one enemy at a time, and does considerable more damage. And you can go in and aim straight for the head, doing a lot more damage. However, this downward swing is a high-risk, high-reward strategy. You're only aiming for one zombie. It can't really hit multiple of them, unlike the sideways swings. The thing is with this one is if you go in, the thing is with Killing Floor, and the thing that I love about it, is they do difficulty super weird, and they make the zombies specifically more twitchy and move a lot more the higher the difficulty is, and they nail difficulty and do difficulty well, but I'll get to difficulty later. The higher the difficulty and the more difficult the zombies are, the more twitchy they get, the more reactionary they get, and they will actually try to avoid you. Something like in a easy difficulty, you'll aim the gun at them and they won't do anything. They'll still keep walking towards you, just like how they would in something like Call of Duty Zombies. But at a higher level, if you aim the gun at a higher difficulty at them, they'll try to avoid out of the way. They'll try to move out of the way. They know where you're aiming, and they'll roll and dodge and be all kinds of fidgety to try to avoid you from hitting headshots, right? And they also twitch a lot, making it where they purposely make it harder for you to hit the headshots, which makes there to be a sort of level of going for body shots and gearing your weapons not only to being hitting heads, because hitting headshots is not always consistent, considering how twitchy and movie these motherfuckers are. But this goes for melee as well, considering if I go in and go for a downward swing and they twitch to the side, they move to the side, they roll to the side, they do whatever to the side, I might go in and hit their shoulder. I might not hit them all the way. I might not hit them in the head. And because of this, I have to take on that recovery. I have to basically have this failed attack go through, and it won't be great. Right, so I have to, it adds a lot of depth and a lot of skill, and I have to know when to parry, I have to know when to block, and there's recovery to these swings, and not only is there recovery to these things, but I can't just keep swinging. I can't just keep swinging, because I have to find openings to block. I have to know when the enemies attack, especially when I'm fighting things like Strakes or Flesh Pounds, right, who are bad mamma jammas. I've got to parry them. I've got to parry them, or I will lose that interaction, right? And that's the lovely thing about Killing Floor, is it always keeps you on your toes. It always keeps you thinking. And the melee combat is amazing. It's beautiful with so much depth. And in fact, some of the enemies will even block a little bit and try to block your attacks. On top of that, you've got a couple other attacks. You've got a couple other options. Some melees have a bash, which pushes enemies back, to try and keep some distance. Sort of something like Titanfall, right? And some melees have a stab, right? Where you can actually aim it and try to aim for their heads, sort of like a gun or like a close range shot. Right? And be actually able to aim for their head without having to kind of fully engage. And it makes there be more of a difference for different melee weapons and give advantage to different melee weapons that you don't get in other games. Like I said, in Black Ops, there's not that big of a difference in melee weapons. They all kind of feel the same. It's just whatever preference you like and whatever you think looks coolest. But this game, there is a difference between the melee weapons. Not only in their stats, but also what they actually do. And it makes them all feel very different and brings some loyalty to them as well. And I love so much about Killing Floor. And this level of combat, I really do wish there was a PvP game that took this level of combat, that took this style of combat, of moving from left to right, moving down, and all this kind of stuff. It would be so good. It would be so cool. And I really do wish there was someone who took this, because this is amazing. This is amazing on so many levels, but it only exists in Killing Floor. It only exists in Killing Floor, and there's so many games like this that are just underrated gems. But because they don't have the highest budget to have the most appealing cosmetics or appeal to everyone, and don't have the best graphics like Paladins and Killing Floor, and also don't have the best competitive integrity either, and aren't the best games for a competitive scene, and aren't the best for being taken competitively like Paladins and Killing Floor, these games get shit on by both competitive and casual players, leaving nobody to play them. And that's why these games fail. It's because they're not marketing their game to a competitive audience. They're not marketing their game to a casual audience either, because they don't really have the budget to do either. And it's really sad that these games do so much good and do so many great things, but people shit on them and don't even give them a chance because they look ugly on the surface, or there's no competitive scene for them, or they have no integrity whatsoever, and people just don't enjoy these games when they have so much good with them. And there's so much potential in a lot of these things, especially Killing Floor, which has so many amazing things in this game that just are not seen elsewhere. And it's sad. And even Titanfall 2 for such a long time was like this until history was revised by Apex players. Hold on. We got a lot of things to talk about someday. But it's sad. It's really sad, and I do wish that a PvP game took this style of combat that Killing Floor offers. I really do. And there's so much potential with it. And it's sad that it's just not. And you could do such a kind of a For Honor style gameplay loop in an FPS game. Make an FPS game where it's a shooter type game with a layer of melee combat. Even put some emphasis on melee combat. Make some of the parts of the game based on melee combat. And have a block mechanic. You have a neutral block that is a sort of all-round safe option, right? And is sort of your low-risk, low-reward option that will offer chip damage and all kinds of things. And then have a block like a left guard, a right guard, an up guard that will block from leftward swings, rightward swings, downward swings, all that kind of stuff. Having sort of a measurement of risk-reward in a For Honor style gameplay loop. And it would be awesome. It would be fucking awesome if there was some PvP type game for this. But there just isn't. And the only place you can experience such a beautiful melee combat is this game, Killing Floor, which just really doesn't get the kind of respect that I think it truly deserves. This game is so much better than what it's gotten, and it kind of is has a cult following, and that's really what it is. It's not a very mainstream game, but melee combat in that game is done perfectly. It's done perfectly. And it makes it where, in most games, melee combat is probably the monkiest, dumbest style of combat in any game. You just get close and start swinging, right? But in this game, it makes it where melee combat is actually the most difficult, most intricate, most complex style of combat, and leaves the most amount of things to think about over something like, over any other style, over shotguns, over assault rifles, over pistols, or sniper rifles. Melee combat is the most difficult to perform and takes not only a lot of awareness and a lot of knowledge, but as well as a lot of just mechanical skill to actually pull off the melee combat in this game. And I love it so much. But yeah, that's about it for the melee combat in FPS. I guess time to eBay. Like and subscribe if you like the video. And that's about it. Peace.
This dummy is a school shooter. Right. I want you to stand back because I don't want you to get hurt. Before he can draw his weapon. Hi, up, hot, hi. How awesome was that?
Well, yeah, that's pretty awesome, but I feel like he would have shot you from a mile away.
No, he wouldn't, because you saw how I was zigzagging like this and making sounds. It was distracting.
Yeah, but did you ever see Indiana Jones where the guy does the whole sword thing and then he just shoots him dead?
Are you asking me if I've seen Indiana Jones? Are you seriously asking me? I've seen that. That is. You're not understanding.
Remember it?
Yes, but if I were to come at you, it's all about how I. Okay, in that circumstance, maybe you got there a little bit faster. But if I... Okay.
I got you again.
What if I zigzag like this?
It's so easy to get you.
That's not necessarily... I don't